Hello, welcome to Virtualization, Creating Virtual Machines. So first thing we're going to do is learn some terms. The first term is host, the machine that is running the virtualization software. So that's the hardware machine that is running the virtualization software. The guest is the virtual machine that is running on the host. So the guest is the virtual machine. A virtual machine, we'll see it's abbreviated VM, is a computer operating system that is running as a guest on a host. It shares resources controlled by the host. It appears to be a real computer. Hypervisor. Hypervisor is also called the Virtual Machine Monitor, a VMM. It's a piece of computer software, firmware, or hardware that creates and runs virtual machines. Three main types of virtualization: para-virtualization, used for running multiple operating systems with window GUIs or testing software. Server, used for running multiple headless servers. Cloud, used for running server farms. And we'll explain each of these in depth next. So para-virtualization, think of it as a desktop. So you have a desktop computer, a PC like we use in the lab or we use at home. And what we do is we run software on top of the operating system. So if you're running Windows 10, you can run VMware Player, VMware Workstation, or Oracle VirtualBox are examples of para-virtualization. So it runs on the host's operating system to control VMs. It's a program that runs on the host operating system. Used to access other desktop-oriented operating systems on the same physical hardware as a host. Doesn't have to be a desktop-oriented operating system, but normally that's what it is. The host machine is Windows GUI based. Example of VM Workstation 10 looks like this. What happens is that you have your main screen here where you can create a new virtual machine and open a virtual machine, and you can do software updates and that. And then also, in this case, there's a list of virtual machines that I had created. I had one called BXST-HQ, which was a server I was testing with Active Directory. I had a client, Windows 7, and Windows 7 could connect up to the BXST-HQ for testing. With virtualization, you can create virtual LAN connections, so you can actually create a network that you can have these guys talking, so you can test out things. I had a telepresence, which is I was testing out a voice over IP system. OpenMCU was testing a video conferencing server. This was CMPS 268. I was testing a lab on here. Wanted to run Ubuntu and see how that works, and Clearos, which is a server operating system. Another VMware you have to pay for, you get a license, but a free one is called Oracle, made one called VirtualBox. Works just as well as VMware Workstation. I've used it. It's quite good. Highly recommended if you're on a budget and need a virtualization. Second type of virtualization is called server virtualization, and examples are Proxmox, VMware ESXi. The host machine is headless. There's no Windows GUI in it. When you run Windows, that Windows GUI, it takes a lot of resources up. So if you can make typically you don't need Windows or a fancy GUI on a server, so they make it headless, which means that you access it through a command line and typically a web browser or remote desktop. It requires less computer resources than desktop because the virtualization is built into the host kernel. So here's something, is that para-virtualization runs as a program on top of a desktop operating system like Windows 10. But server virtualization is built into the host kernel, right? So the kernel is basically the guts of the operating system. Guest virtual machines are typically server-based in server virtualization. It's for servers. Here's an example of Proxmox. Proxmox is free. I've been using it for probably 5-6 years now. Incredibly stable. I highly recommend this one. I have a lab where we create for our students, we have 40 groups, and what happens is that we have to create voice over IP PBXs, private branch exchanges. And in the old days, I would have to have create 40 physical machines. It would take me 2 to 3 weeks to set up 40 virtual machines. Now with Proxmox, it takes maybe a minute and a half to create a virtual machine. I have a template I created, and then I just clone that template and pops up really fast. The third type is called cloud virtualization. Examples are Eucalyptus and Amazon. They're used for server farms, and typically you want high availability, and you also are running multiple instances of the same image. So here's an example of Eucalyptus. This is the dashboard for it. And this one says we've got 6 running instances. We have no stopped. We can scale the instances up and down, which add more resources to it. Could be more CPU power, more memory, more hard drive space. We can add more virtual machines to the group and make it bigger and more powerful. And that we can do things like take snapshots. Snapshots is, let's say you're developing a server or you're developing a project, and what you can do at any instant, you can take a snapshot. It's like a backup that you're going to just hold on to, keep developing, and maybe you go, no, I didn't want to go in that direction. Then you can restore that snapshot. Over here is volumes. What happens is that you have your hard drives or your storage as volumes, and with volumes what you can do is you can add hard drives to it and change the size and manipulate it that way. So you can take physical hard drives, combine them from a RAID system, as an example, and that becomes your volume. You say, I need more storage space, so then you take another RAID array and add it to the volume. So it makes it very flexible in storage requirements. Amazon clouds. So what Amazon has 4 main locations across the world. They got US West, US East, Europe, and Asia Pacific. And what they have is their server farms are all virtualization, and they call it AWS. And that big topic right now. We're just going to go through the steps to create a virtual machine. This was an in-class exercise, but we'll only take it just through the initial steps, and then we'll stop it there. All right, so we're going to create a virtual environment. What we're going to have, this is our host. This would be our PC that we're going to run our virtual machine on. We're going to run using VMware Workstation or VMware Player. And what we're going to have is 2 virtual machines. One virtual machine is going to be a server that's going to run Clearos. We're going to have it connect directly to the public network that's called Bridged. And we're going to have we'll create a private LAN. This LAN name can be anything you want. We just called it private LAN. We'll have another virtual machine running CentOS as a guest, and we'll actually create our own little network here. And our Clearos will actually be doing some network address translation and do a DHCP on it to provide an IP address to the CentOS. So very first thing, we'll create a virtual machine. There's a button here that says create new virtual machine, and we'll do it under VMware, and that's what we'll select. First thing that comes up is a menu, and what we're going to do is just a typical installation, because basically it works, right? I don't think I've ever used the custom or advanced installation. And that 2 windows are going to pop up. Very first one is going to be, we have a choice. Are we going to install the operating system from the CD-ROM or DVD player, or from an ISO image? We'll do an ISO image, so we can download ISO images. And these are the images that we'd use to burn a CD, but we can use them directly. And this one will be Clearos. And then we'll say what the operating system is. So we have a choice of Microsoft Windows, Linux, Novell, Solaris. And in our case, it's Linux. And then we would, from the pull-down menu, would select CentOS 64-bit. We give it a name. Name here I chose was Clearos-1. It could be any name you want. And then it's going to say, where's the location that you want your virtual machines? Well, On my computer under Documents, I put a folder called Virtual Machines, and that's where I put them in. And that there's probably a default one. I don't remember. Then you say how much disk storage space is going to be used, right? So in this case, we're going to say 20 gigabytes, which is plenty for what we're doing. We probably get away with 10, and that we're just playing around, so we don't need and that default setting, split virtual disk into multiple files. One of the steps here is you don't have to do it, but we're going to go through it, is to customize the hardware, right? And the hardware would be things like the hard disk, the memory, the network adapter. So when we customize the hardware, what we'll see is that we can change the size of the memory, how many processors, the location of the ISO image, or what our network adapter is going to do, USB, sound card, etc. So when we look at the hardware options, the memory, you can set how much memory from the host machine will be allocated to the virtual machine. So one of the requirements of a host machine is to have lots of RAM, right? So I have a virtualization server, and it's got 128 gigabytes of RAM, right? So typically the more RAM, the better. That machine services 40 virtual machines or servers, so it needs lots of RAM. CPUs, set how many cores from the host machine CPU that will be used by the virtual machine. One core is one virtual CPU. Again, on that virtual server I have 4 10-core processors, so I have 40 cores available. What will happen is they'll share the cores, which is okay. I used to get away with 16, it would work fine. And 16, I could put 40 virtual machines on it, and it would work okay. But the cores were starting to they were peaking out about 80 to 90%, right? So we updated it to a new virtualization server that has 40 cores, and now we find out that the machine is just so smooth, it's just incredible. We're running around 5% load on it with 40. CD/DVD, that'll select between using the host DVD player or an ISO image. We selected ISO image. Next, we can check our network adapter choices. So what happens is that when we select on the network adapter, we have choices that are bridged, NAT, host only, and custom. Let's see what we got here. So bridged mode, it connects to the LAN the same as a host. So if you set your network adapter for bridged, that means that you're going to connect to the same LAN that the host does and pull an IP address the same as the host. That, or network address translation, the virtual machine is on a private network while the host will perform network address translation to the LAN. So the host is going to pretend to be a router, right? And the router is going to be doing network address translation. Similar to what a Wi-Fi router does. Wi-Fi router hooks up to your service provider, and then it does network address translation, provides a private IP network for your computers at home. Host only, the VM is on a private network and cannot connect to the outside network. So here's some pictures of it. So this is in bridged mode. So here's my host. It's connected up to our public network. This would be at SAID, it would be 10.0.0. Our guest in bridge mode would get an IP address from the public network, and it would connect to the public network as if it's directly connected. In NAT mode, what happens is our host becomes a router. So it's connected to the public network. Then it provides DHCP and a private LAN to our guest. So this would have as I mentioned before, SAIT has an IP address of 10.0.0.0. On this side, we'd have a private LAN of like 192.168.0.1 or something like that. Host only means that the host is the only one that's connected to the public network, and the guest can only talk to the private LAN and the host. That's all it can do. It has no access to here. What happens is that you could hook up, no, that's all it would be for here. So choices, we can modify the configuration of the bridge, NAT or NAT host only, change which interface to use. You can say, well, bridge mode, okay, I'm going to connect to a different one. Port forwarding is using network address translation, and DHCP settings, where we can set NAT and custom. So we can modify our choices there. We have something called a LAN segment. We can create a LAN segment, a private LAN with no connection to the host, and we can manually configure NAT and DHCP for it. And we can call this any name we want. So right now it says private LAN, that's the default, but you can create a network and call it Joe's LAN or if you wanted. Some other options besides the ones we talked about is USB controller. We can allow access to the host machine's USB devices. We actually do that in the lab. We have some devices that have to run under Windows 7 or Windows XP or Windows 32-bit, and these are applications that run under that. They won't run under Windows 10 and they won't run under 64-bit, but they still have to access a USB port. We can do that. Sound card can auto detect the sound card. Printer can access the host connected printers, and display will configure to use the host display. So as an exercise, what we were going to do in the classroom was to build this network, right? We would build on our host, which is connected to public network, we would create a server and we'd have two NICs on it. The first NIC, NIC 1, would be bridged to the public network, and the second NIC would be connected to a private LAN. So one of the things we do is we look at our network adapter, make sure that it's set in bridged mode, and then we would add another network adapter. And first what we'll do is make it bridged, then change it later to LAN segment. Right? So we've got our first network adapter here. It says bridged. The second one is network adapter. It's bridged. And what we're going to do is change it to a LAN segment. When we click on LAN segments, what we see is that I had been working on this before. I had like E112 network was a LAN segment I called, and AD network, which I use for Active Directory, and then LAN segment 2 and 3. And here's one we called private LAN. You can just add and rename them here. Now we're ready to create the virtual machine. That's the only change we wanted. And if you'll notice here, you can review your specs. So I got 20 gigabyte hard drive, 1 gigabyte memory, which is pretty low, a bridge network adapter in that. And then we say finish, and it's going to create our machine. So when the machine's created, it's powered off. And again, we can review our criteria: memory, processors, hard disk. If we find our memory is too low, like 1 gigabyte, we can always go in and change it to a larger size, like 2 gigabyte or 4 gigabyte. But you have to be aware of how much memory is available on the host machine. Right? So if you have 8 gig on your host machine, and then you decide I'm going to use 6 gig for my virtual machine, your host machine is going to crash. It doesn't have enough memory to support it. If you change the memory, you have to power off the virtual machine and then power it on again. You have to cycle it. So some of these changes you have to cycle, right? So we'll power on the virtual machine, and when we power on, it ends up doing an installation of Clearos. So way back when we said the iOS we're going to use is Clearos, and now we're going through the installation process of Clearos, just as if we had installed Clearos on a hardware device. We're going to stop there. The rest of this presentation is based on steps on continuing to make this a virtual environment, and we can't do that at this time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, click on the like button and subscribe, and please leave comments in the comment section.